Hi there, just read this disclaimer please. Hey guys, to be honest I'm a little bit worried that I might have misled people, not on purpose, because I've basically, I'll get to the point. This article I've just come across a few days ago, from the 23rd of April, and it talks about the revenue reserves of investment trusts. But basically, I'll link this article in the description. It's telling us about how investment trusts' revenue reserves actually work. The upshot of it is they actually can do whatever they want. Because I think, what's the phrase this article uses? I think it says something, here we go. It says, actually, the revenue reserve is simply a bookkeeping entry. So, when if it says the revenue reserves are, what, I don't know, like 58 million quid or something, that doesn't actually correspond to any specific assets or bank accounts within the trust or cash within the trust. It's like it says, it's a bookkeeping entry, and actually it doesn't influence at all how they invest it. They just see it as a pot of money that they invest or don't invest, or in whatever they want, and they have a certain level of cash which is independent of the revenue reserve. Basically, lower in the article, basically it says that most don't really talk about it in their annual report. They don't say how the revenue reserve is invested. And the level of cash that they have on hand at any one moment is normally a lot less than the revenue reserves, typically, I don't know. Obviously each trust, I mean, if a trust wanted, if the fund manager of a trust wanted to do it the way some people might assume they do it, by keeping it literally in cash, they could do it like that if they wanted. But I don't think many do. And when I've kind of thought about it in more detail, it kind of makes sense. I've kind of collated some data here from City of London's previous annual reports, and I've found the information of the level of the revenue reserves, how much was added from it or taken away from it each year, and the revenue reserve per share that was quoted in each of their annual reports. I've calculated this myself, the revenue reserve as a percentage of the net asset value. So this is on the 30th of June, the kind of official year end of the trust. And as you can see, as a percentage of the net asset value, the revenue reserve fluctuates as the net asset value fluctuates, obviously, by definition. So you basically you want this number to be as low as possible when you actually use some of the revenue reserve, because it's actually taking away from your net asset value when you use it. And so obviously now we find ourselves with a lower net asset value, don't we? What are we on now? I think we're on about 360, something like 360 at the moment. So so that number would actually be higher than 3.66. So obviously right now it'd be good if they'd always just kept the revenue reserves in cash, that the value doesn't fluctuate at all. But if you think longer term than that, if you think back to the good times when the net asset value was at its highest, but in those good times we'd be thankful that actually they have just invested the revenue reserves along with the rest of the portfolio, because obviously generally prices go up and you get dividends from the money you've invested. So over the long term it's probably better that they just invest it with the rest of the portfolio. But actually, in the bad times, this is when it's not good. We would actually like it if they hadn't had it invested. So I've done a little experiment, a little play around with some numbers here, because obviously, I mean, what we've got here is the dividend per share. That's the last known number, 18.6 a year, and the revenue per share, which I've got from the annual reports. So let's pretend what I've done here is I've worked out a worst case scenario that doesn't use more than the 15.4 revenue reserve per share that we have on City of London at the 30th of June. Say if we have a 35% drop in the revenues, I've only put 35% because that makes these numbers work. Chances are it'll be a higher number, a bigger drop than that. That brings the revenue per share down to 12.87 pence instead of 19.8. Next year's is going to be 19p. Because we've already had 4.75p paid as like the level of the dividend, so that's times 4. And then what I've done from then on is I've just added 0.5% to the dividend just so that it can keep that long record of dividend increases. But as you can see in the first year, the revenues per share go down to that amount, say, but the dividend goes up to 19p. So that means that 6.13 pence of the revenue reserve per share has to be used that year. And what I've got here is 6.13 pence divided by the net asset value. So it would actually be selling 1.7% of the trust's assets to pay that dividend if the net asset value was 360, on average. Whenever they decided to do that selling, maybe they got 360p, I don't know, could be a lower price than that. So by selling 6.13 pence worth of the net asset value per share, it actually reduces the dividends, the revenue per share in the next year, because there's fewer shares, fewer assets generating those revenues. So say there was a 20% increase in the portfolio's dividends, that would actually equate to a 20% increase, but then it would also have a 1.7% reduction, because we've got 1.7% less assets to get that revenue from. So actually, that's why I've got it multiplied by that number as well in each of these lines. But obviously, as the net asset value goes up, I've kind of put in like a 5% a year recovery over the next few years, and that slightly helps this number, because it's, the denominator is higher as time goes by, and these are the numbers basically that keep us with the revenue reserve not going to zero. Gets close to zero, but doesn't go to zero. Like the article says, this revenue reserve isn't actually a magical wand that magically keeps the money. And I'm not sure that I would want it to be, actually, the more I think about it. Because as I said before, if we had these percentages of the net asset value in cash each time, in the good years, it would be dragging back the performance of the trust by, in today's low interest rate environment, well, maybe not in 2008. Well, actually, it wasn't long after that the interest rates went down to like 0.5, wasn't it? Not long after that, anyway. But yeah, for most of this time period, interest rates on cash would have been rock bottom, and the net asset value is going up, and you're also getting, maybe 4% dividend yield, roughly, depends on the year and the share prices. So it would have been dragging the performance over all these years. Even though it's having a negative effect on us now, we would have missed all of the good years of having that revenue reserve invested. So I've kind of mixed feelings about it. What I do dislike, though, is the way it's communicated in the media. It's only until the CRAP started hitting the fan that this article kind of grabbed my attention. 23rd of April 2020. It would have been nice if in all of these good years, when revenue reserves were talked about with investment trust, it would have been nice if that kind of detail was included, telling us that actually it's invested just like anything else, but it does help in the long term to smooth out the dividend payments. Now, my question is, how do the investment trust managers think about this? Because to my mind, I would like it if they had in the back of their minds when they're constructing their portfolios certain assets that, in times of needing to delve into the revenue reserves, I'd like it if they had in their mind which assets might be the ones to get sold. Because obviously, when they sell this 1.7% in my little example, it'd be nice to sell 1.7% of an asset that has a low yield, perhaps, so that this number gets helped, or the number in the year after gets helped. So when you're reducing the NAV per share by 1.7%, the revenue per share doesn't go down by 1.7%. Maybe it goes down by 0.5% instead, if you have some low yielding assets that you could sell, or perhaps some like counter-cyclical assets which have done better in this time, they could be the ones that are sold. But then, you know, doing stuff like that, it could hinder your portfolio's capital performance going forward, couldn't it? So it's a tricky one. But then obviously that's why fund managers get paid. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know how fund managers think about it. Not necessarily in this year. I'd like to know how they think about revenue reserves getting used in the future. They should be thinking about it in all of these years. Well, actually, from that year onwards, they should be thinking about it, shouldn't they? In the good times, think about what assets to put in the portfolio that can be used in these years, and that year there where it was used. One little thing to note here is that the revenue reserve per share is also affected by issues of equity and transactions in shares. So when they buy back their own shares or they issue more shares, that affects this number, because you'll probably notice I put this spreadsheet together a little while ago, so I forget, but there's 1 year here where these numbers make no sense. Where is it? Ah, yes, this year here. You see there, they added over 1 million into the revenue reserve, but the revenue reserve per share has gone down. So I had to double check this number. And actually, when I went into the 2012 annual report, I noticed they had a massive year for issuing equity of the trust. So it got diluted by issues of equity, basically. I mean, that's annoying because it reduces the revenue reserves. But actually, if you do fully read this article, it also talks about actually the rules changed anyway for investment trusts. And they can actually just use the capital. They don't actually need to pay attention to this revenue reserve. Apparently, if you read lower, it talks more about it in this article. And actually, if they were doing all right, like capital-wise, like I've mentioned Scottish Mortgage before, it's paid out, it's very tiny dividend. It's been paid out from capital for years because they're allowed to do that if they want. So actually, even though it's annoying that issues of equity reduce this number, probably not the end of the world, because actually it's more about the performance of the portfolio rather than the actual revenue reserve, I think. Anyway, I don't know. Like I say, I still don't probably fully understand it, so don't take everything I've said as gospel. I just wanted to make sure that things I've said in the past haven't misled anyone. I'm just editing the video now. One thing I forgot to mention was, of course, the gearing. Now, obviously, the best time to take on borrowing for the investments trust are where the prices are low. So that would go hand in hand with the moment they need to pay out money from the revenue reserves, mostly, a lot of the time. So I guess, theoretically, instead of selling capital, I mean, to be honest, this kind of amounts to the same thing. The time when the share NAVs are low would be a good time. Well, only in hindsight you'd know when the low is, in quotes. But in hindsight, this point here would have been a great time to take on more gearing. And then you're getting amplified investment returns then, aren't you, from that point onwards as it goes up, because you've got more borrowing. So I suppose instead of selling the 1.7% we had in my little example of assets to pay the dividend in that next year, they could just increase the gearing from 109% to 111%, couldn't they, instead? And instead of buying assets with the extra borrowing, just pay the dividend with it. I mean, I guess really they should be independent decisions. The decision to take on more borrowing, which I think might be a board decision, not possibly, I'm not sure. It might be the board of the investment trust that decides that rather than the investment managers. I don't know, maybe they discuss it, I don't know. But maybe those two decisions might be kind of independent of each other. But in this scenario, in hindsight, it would have been great to take on gearing here and then paid the dividend from selling capital. But I mean, the fact that you have to sell capital and also buy, you might as well just spend the extra borrowing on the dividend instead of having the transactional costs of buying assets and then selling them again to pay the dividend in a few months' time. If you see what I mean? They kind of amounts to the same thing. So that's one option. as well, I think. Anyway, it's just more food for thought. I don't know, I kind of got myself in a bit of a muddle thinking about this. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Bye bye.